Right, so October and November were a bit of a disaster, but stuff it. Let's try and end the year on a bit of a high, eh? Starting off in true Art Attack fashion, here's one I made earlier. I sourced this body from the Assault Intercessors kit, along with a head that was suitably bald and clean shaven, which should make adding green stuff onto it a bit easier. The backpack and shoulder pads could have come from this kit, but as I wasn't sure how well the shoulder pads would work with the arms I had in mind, I went with the slightly smaller ones from the regular Intercessors box. Said arms, shown here, were taken from the Legion Mark VI Assault Squad, which provided 2 lightning claws for the ambidextrously inclined. In case you're wondering, I am partly making this model because, while it might not be an original idea, Santa Claus is exactly the kind of stupid pun that I get a kick out of. With everything cleaned up, I assembled the fists, stuck on the claws, and put them to the side. It was time to confront the worst green thing you can come across at Christmas. My old nemesis. Green stuff. At Christmas. Anyway, I cut out a roughly 60-40 mix of yellow and blue stuff, rolled it up to combine it, then mixed in a bit of Milliput to help make it slightly less awful to work with. In preparation for this project, I searched for materials on how to make green stuff fur, and came across this brilliant tutorial by Balbjorn, which I've linked to in the description. I'll do my best to describe the process, but would really recommend watching the link video to see how it's done by someone who actually knows what they're doing. 95% of the work would be done by this bad boy here. This blubber looking thing is a fur texture plate from Green Stuff World, and it basically acts as a mould for pressing green stuff into. First things first, waterboard it to prevent the green stuff from sticking to it, then take a suitably sized bit of green stuff and press it firmly into the texture plate, making sure it's as level as possible. Next, remove it with some hard tools and then press it onto the model, trying not to smush any of the detail away. If you want, you can then use some tools to further shape the pelt or refine the small details. But yeah, that was pretty much all there was to it. I temporarily superglued the arms onto the body so that I could paint them separately later on, then repeated the trim creation process for the boots with the fur and the shoulder pad lining. Taking a welcome break from green stuff, I sourced these scrolls holding the Naughty and Nice list from the Legion Mark VI Tactical Squad Kit and glued them onto his arse flap. A tutorial I found for sculpting facial hair recommended attaching the head first, so I did just that. I wanted to give him a great big bushy beard, so I created this monstrosity out of pure green stuff. Sure enough, I had an absolute nightmare trying to get it onto his face, so I gave up following this tutorial and went rogue with rolling out a noodle instead. Smushing said noodle against his head, I gave him a magnificent sideburn which transitioned to a neckbeard, then back into another sideburn on the opposite side of his face. And the result was something vaguely resembling a beard. Feeling like a bit of a noob for using raw green stuff, I mixed in some Milliput and hoped this would be nicer to work with. This mixture was then added around his beard to bury my first attempt and to give it some extra bulk. I wanted the rest of the beard to be quite long and wispy, so I rolled out some more green noodles and shaped these into an approximation of Davy Jones's face tentacles. Using a soft silicone tool, I gradually rolled these strands together and shaped the beard to kind of look like it was blown in the wind. The end result looked a bit scraggly and greasy, but for a first attempt I'll take it. Lastly, I gave him a dastardly mustache and used some silicone tools and my hobby knife to shape and trim it to form. All that was left now was to give Santa his wee hat. Starting with a cylinder of green stuff, I rolled out one end to shape it into a cone. Refining the scale of this bit of green stuff, I eventually got it into a suitably sized dunce cap, which I then fastened to his head before bending the tip back to shape it as desired. Next, I rolled out a tiny ball of green stuff for the bauble and used some superglue to attach it to the hat. Then, using the same process as for the rest of the fur, I rolled out a line of green stuff, pressed it into the texture plate, then stuck it onto the hat. And with that, I'd passed through the 9 circles of green stuff hell. The base got a couple of token bits of cork superglued to it, and it was time for painting. Now, I don't love the process of painting, so as a wee Black Friday gift to myself, I picked up an airbrush to hopefully make it a wee bit more enjoyable. To start, I primed everything with Vallejo's white primer, which, based on an internet stranger's advice, I had thinned down about 1:1 with Vallejo's airbrush thinner. This mixture was a bit thin and ended up removing a bit of detail, so in hindsight I should have A. tested it on another model instead of a bit of cardboard, and B. tried the primer straight out of the bottle as per the instructions. But hey ho. Ho ho. Lesson kinda learned, I then moved on to basing the model with a mixture of 3 parts Vallejo Model Air Red to 1 part thinner, with a wee drop of flow improver. This seemed to work much better, and seeing how quickly I was able to build up a really vibrant red was awesome. On top of this first coat, I tried to go for a zenithal highlight with some Vallejo Game Air Bloody Red, but I don't think you can tell at all from the end result, so I'll need a better colour contrast next time. Once the paint had dried, I reenacted separating the left arm from its body before going full Chewbacca mode on camera for the other one. These have been superglued onto some wire sticks and bits of cork for me to hold onto while painting later. This should have been done before priming, but I had a bit of a brain fart with focusing so much on how to use the airbrush that I forgot. As it was, I then went over these missed sections with bloody red again, not caring about priming them first, as they'd either be hidden or I'd be scraping the paint off later anyway. With a solid red foundation in place, I used Mechanicus Standard Grey to coat the joints of the armour and soles of the boots. Mournfang Brown was then applied to the belt and the back straps to act as a base for the leather. Next, I painted the lists, coating them twice with a couple of thin coats of Rakarth Flesh. Black Legion contrast paint was then used for the inner panel of the backpack and for the cables running along the power fists. To add a little bit of Christmas green into the colour scheme, Caliban Green was used on the smaller cables and on the festive grenade that's reserved for those who have been really bad this year. I then used Kislev Flesh to act as the base coat for the face, making sure to pick out the ears hidden behind the sideburns. Then, while waiting for everything to dry, I returned to Mechanicus Standard Grey for the rocks. For the white, I got myself some Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White based on the recommendation from my previous video. Immediately I was impressed by how much smoother and quicker it was to get decent coverage with this paint than ones I'd been using previously. I applied this liberally across the first sections and the base to build up a pretty decent looking white in 3-ish coats. Now, red was a bit of a bold colour to try and cover over directly, and some of it is still a bit visible, so I resolved to build up the white via light grey later on to see how that worked. For the gold, I used all reliable Retributor Armour mixed with some Lahmian Medium to help it flow a bit better. I applied this around the model for all the gold details and across the bulk of the lightning claws to make them look like something Santa would have made in his workshop. Next, I turned to Leadbelcher with Lahmian Medium to pick out the cabling on the lightning claws, the wires no one ever sees in the backpack, and the grenade bits. Lesson learned from the fur trim, I coated the claws in Celestra Grey to act as a base to build the white up from, but left doing the white until the end as I would inevitably spill a wash onto them. Speaking of, to start the shading process, I used Reikland Fleshshade across all the gold areas to give them a warm, antique look. I also then applied this to a very blurry Santa's face. Next, I mixed up a concoction of 1 part Black Legion to 3 parts Contrast Medium, and applied this to all the areas of the armour which had previously been coated in Mechanicus Standard Grey. The idea here being that the black would get down into all the recesses and leave the original grey as highlights. Overall, I think this worked okay. I think next time though I'll try a thinner mixture and build it up as needed. Moving on, I coated the scrolls with Seraphim Sepia, then used Agrax Earthshade to shade the leather back straps. Nuln Oil was then applied to the grenade and to the silver sections of the lightning claws. For the red armour, I wanted some Druchii Violet for some targeted recess shading. I could have pushed this a bit more, but with it being an airbrush paint, bloody red took far too many bloody coats to cover up any overspill, and at this point I didn't want to extend this project much longer. Even though it wouldn't really be seen, in case any colour did peek through, I covered the base with some Pylar Glacier so that any gaps would look more icy. For the fur, I initially applied Apothecary White straight out the bottle, which ended up being far too strong. I thinned it down with a ratio of 1 part Apothecary White to 3 parts Contrast Medium and used that mix for the rest of the fur sections and for the beard. With the washes all applied, I returned to Rakarth Flesh to highlight the edges of the scroll, then did the same for the grenade with Caliban Green. Wild Rider Red was used on the armour for some of the easier edge highlights where I used hard edges to do most of the work for me. Similarly, Stormhost Silver was applied to some sharper sections on the gold to help them stand out a bit more. Finally, once everything had been cleaned up, I covered the lightning claws in bold titanium white, followed by Frostheart, which looked like this when the camera actually behaves. For the base, I applied Valhallan Blizzard generously across the whole base, using an old brush to apply it into the recesses on the boots and on top of the rocks. Once that had dried, all that was left to do was separate the various pieces from their lollipop sticks, scrape away some Christmas scratch cards, and superglue everything back together. One final coat of Black Legion around the rim, and Santa Claus had come to town. thank you so much for watching. This was quite an interesting project for me, with trying out some new tools and paints, and I feel like I've learned some useful stuff. I'm especially looking forward to trying out the Airbrush some more and figuring out how to do shading, etc. Anyway, wishing you a very happy holiday season and look forward to some more projects in the new year. Catch you in 2025.